You're listening to Talking Threat Intelligence, a podcast dedicated to uncovering the new challenges of today's threat landscape. Each episode, we connect with some of the world's leading practitioners to share stories from the front lines of corporate security. And now, on to the show.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Talking Threat Intelligence. I'm your host, Robert Ballew, and joining me today is Kelly Pereira, Investigations Manager in the content protection industry. Kelly, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Now, Kelly, last time we chatted, you and I had a great conversation about people maybe being a little bit too eager and jumping in too quickly into OSINT investigations, especially at the beginning of their career, and that they don't spend enough time developing the fundamentals of the tradecraft. Can you tell listeners a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's quite understandable. OSINT's the cool thing of these days. Everyone wants to get stuck into the sexy stuff. However, and perhaps I'm speaking from a fortunate position, it's worth exploring the core fundamentals, the structured processes, the preparation. And so, yeah, I do believe in that, just to lay that groundwork to set you up for success later.
Let's elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by that, by the core fundamentals. Can you explain that a bit more for listeners?
Yeah, sure. So I believe in understanding what it is you're setting out to do, to understand your aim, what you want to achieve, and the end goal of why you're doing it. And I would encourage people to never feel cautious about saying, what's the purpose? What do you want to achieve from this? So it's good to always understand your aim at the very root of everything. But as a practitioner, it's really valuable to understand your options and about how you approach OSINT, exploitation of OSINT out there.
Right. When did you kind of become aware that this was so important? Was there like one moment where it really became a big example in your career development?
Yeah, and I believe, as I sort of briefly referred to then, I was in a fortunate position to spend a decade in the British police. That really does set you up in an environment of discipline and structure. You have to play by the law, play by the book. So when I first joined the police, I was exposed to 13 weeks of training, and that encompassed everything from software, legislation, critical thinking, emotional side of investigations. And, you know, as part of that, what options you have out there. And in those days, you know, with the police, you have closed source as well as open sources, but set you up for the skeleton of what you needed to keep on board as a practitioner before you went out into the field and actually did the legwork. So early days, came back to the start. And then moving forward, you start to see that end goal in those days was caught, or it was presenting evidence, and you don't want to get to that end point and realize there were failings early on. So by preparation is always better than cure. It's better to prepare well ahead and to have that core structure in what you approach.
That's why I was so excited to have you on the show this week, because you have that law enforcement background and the grounding on all those, like you said, the understanding of the law and a lot of that operational security, which, you know, people that maybe just set up the Twitter account and just want to jump in don't get to have that kind of training and background. I was having this conversation with Laurent Bodo on the show recently, and he was saying, if you set up a Twitter account, you can call yourself an OSINT analyst, but, you know, if you set up rent a medical office, you can't call yourself a doctor or anything like that. So that just the barriers to entry are so much lower, quote unquote, than say other fields.
Yeah, totally agree. And from the broad exposure of attack on the Capitol building last year, all the OSINTers and communities came out of the woodwork and claimed to be able to identify people. And there were so many misidentifications in that. People's lives were wrecked, in the extreme example. So again, it's people jumping online thinking they can just set out and do it. And it's a benefit to all involved. It's exciting. You want to get stuck in, but to have that understanding of appropriate hygiene and practice will set you up in the long term, and it will make you a more respected practitioner as well in your community. So doing things properly.
Right. A good example that you mentioned there. I do remember after the Capitol riots, just a couple of weeks after the fact, just hearing those stories of the people that were falsely identified. And then going back to the conversation I had with Laurent, he's doing a lot of he was doing a lot of terrorism research, which it sounds cool to jump into, but if you don't have the foundations right, you could have a wrong person knocking at your door very quickly, or in any other field that you might be working in, if you're dealing with some nasty people online. So definitely important to get your 101 stuff sorted out.
Yeah. And I mean, there's a certain extent where you can cast your net widely. You can gather and under time pressure, perhaps you can go out there and collect things, but it's important to then filter it later, to process it. And that's when information becomes intelligence, by adding that filtering. And again, that's a key thing that the police do. You need to assess the reliability of the data that you capture, be processed, prioritized, and then it can only be acted on, ideally.
Right. Well, let's then jump into some of that stuff that you were taught at the beginning of your career in the law enforcement world that you take to your work every day. So if I'm starting out as an OSINT analyst, or a lot of beginners that are kind of approaching this topic, what are some of the common mistakes that you see that they're making?
Immediately off the bat, I'd say coming in with preconceptions, bias. I've had exposure to people who say that have gone into their investigations looking to prove their initial belief. They already go in with an understanding on expectation of what they expect to find, and then they're looking for the material to support that, which is completely about face. You need to go in there with a clean slate, hypothesize what might be the case for all means, but then be open-minded enough to reject hypotheses. And it's okay to say, I don't know what the answer is. We've got X, Y, and Z, which indicate a possibility, but I can only interpret it as this. And a favourite word of mine is inference. So it's important not just to say if something's black or white, there are shades in there, and to make that inference based on your investigations, the open source intelligence that you've been able to develop, what your belief is, situation to be at that point. So get to that end point down the road, not first off.
That's a really good takeaway. One thing that we talked about too during our previous conversation a couple of weeks ago was just kind of operational security 101. Can you elaborate a bit more on that?
We can't be naive enough to think that just because we're doing all the sexy online investigations, that other people are not defending themselves by doing the same on people who are investigating them. So that reconnaissance happens both ways. It should be second instinct, second nature to have investigative isolated machines, virtual machines, VPNs. Take the time to set up sock puppet pseudonym accounts and to do them early on, have a variety of identities and to draw on later that have some heritage, some backstory, so you look convincing in your approach. Don't cross-contaminate your social media accounts, either across fake accounts or with your own personal account, God forbid. And just to sort of anticipate and prepare, invest the time. If you have a downtime, lazy afternoon, just go on and create another Gmail account so that it has that heritage, and you're not going to get booted off through suspicious activity hurried later.
I've heard some interesting stories over the years from people who may have just been, conducting investigation, check one thing on their personal device, and now their personal device is part of the chain of evidence that is getting subpoenaed in a court case or something like that, which is the worst case scenario for a lot of situations as an investigator.
Yeah, I mean, everything from cookies, cross-contamination, recommended friends, but also the risk exists of you having to forfeit personal devices, personal accounts to law enforcement. It's disclosable as evidence. So don't bring it into the equation in the first place. Keep it isolated. And I would go so far to say as you try as much as possible to isolate accounts across different projects and investigations so that you're not using Joe Blogs for 3 different cases. You have to forfeit that account for one case and you've lost its use for others. So it's hard work. It needs some planning and spreadsheets to track, perhaps password protected. But it's certainly, it's worth doing. It's that early investment.
Let's switch gears for a little bit. I kind of want to talk from the perspective of someone who has had a successful career in law enforcement and then made the successful transition into the corporate environment. What kind of advice would you have for someone? Because that's a lot of people with our listener base is people who had maybe a military or law enforcement background and then moved into the corporate world and they're kind of trying to find their feet with that. What kind of advice would you have for someone who has maybe found themselves in that position that you were a couple of years back?
I would say I've seen a lot of companies out there claiming to facilitate that transition, to make a difficult situation better. It's not as difficult. From my experience, and I've had colleagues coming from law enforcement background, military, it's the skills that you get in these disciplined environments are highly valued. So be celebrated, promote it on your online professional accounts, on your CVs, resumes. It's valued. And I have been in a recruitment position before, and I've looked out for people who have had that quality training. They've had that discipline. They've had exposure to theory, intelligence cycle, giving evidence in court. That's half the work. The only caution I would say is that transition into the corporate life, you're not sort of recognizing hierarchy quite so much. You'll have managers, senior staff. You can afford to relax and to see each other as team members, collaborative partners rather than sirs, and don't be intimidated in that sense. So you can afford to dilute some of your language in reporting, no ETAs or that sort of acronyms. It's recognize the skills you bring to a range of contexts that you can reapply and celebrate it. So, I use it for one.
Well, I want to dive in a little bit more into that context of communication there, that key phrase that you use, dilute your language. Can you elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, I mean, it needs to be formal to a certain extent, but once you transition from public sector to corporate life, your audience it can be a range of people. It's going to be people who have vested interest, stakeholders in a product, in an asset, rather than upholding the law. As long as you recognise what their pain points are and how your work is aiming to assist them, to support them, it's something that you don't need to be saying in very robotic, you might find law enforcement, as in a statement, but it should be relaxed, I'd say, to meet the nature of what the audience wants to hear. What's the question they want answering? So you can afford to be very more succinct, even just clear to the point. And there's ways that I've structured the way that I investigate projects as well, like 3-point plans.
3-point plans. What do you mean by that?
Once you go out and you do online investigations, there's a bulk of big data. Some of it's going to be useful, immediately relevant. Some of it's going to be cautiously of interest. You might need to draw on later. So you need to scale back all that data into a structure. And what I tend to encourage people to do is to understand, firstly, what the problem is. Then you would say you need to find out who's responsible, be it an individuals or a company, a body of people. What is causing this? What is prompting this problem? And then thirdly, understand what evidence you have in support of that. So that could be online investigations, conversations that you've had covertly with the people, screenshots, test purchases, even if it's a product that's being infringed upon. So in summary, what's the problem? Who's responsible? And what evidence do I have in support of it? It really does sum up. If you focus on those 3 streams, usually can encompass a lot of data into a succinct pot of knowledge.
No. Yeah, going back to the communication thing, I think that's one of the issues that talking to a lot of people on this podcast has been kind of a tripping point, because if you come from especially like the military side or something where it can be quite intimidating for someone in a civilian context to be hearing a lot of that jargon. If you work at a tech company or a manufacturing company, you're not used to that. And so if there's any of those barriers between the intelligence group on the team and the people that are the decision makers, that's just one more barrier to being an effective contributor to the organization. So I like that kind of diluting your language a little bit and keeping that. I really like that takeaway. And it's a theme I've heard a lot elaborated on this show.
Communication is very important. Yeah. Be that written, spoken, presentations, it's paramount. If you can capture that, you're winning.
Did you have any experiences when you were making that transition that kind of stood out as like, oh, this is very different from the law enforcement world to corporate?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of what I say is from experience. So for sure that there were times when I would go in my corporate job, you'd be accountable to your manager. You would say there was a certain amount of intimidation with a manager, you're answerable to them. And you'd say, I'm going to knock off for the day now. I was like, yeah, you've done your hours, you've hit your deadlines. You're not that in such a disciplined environment. So own it for yourself and what you are achieving and contribute in that sense.
I kind of want to go now a little bit slightly different angle too, which I think would be interesting. You've been kind of working your way up the corporate hierarchy, it seems. And so you've had some success. So I want to pick your brain a little bit. Talk to me as if I'm maybe an experienced OSINT analyst, kind of at an investigator level, and I'm looking to try to start working my way up or make a bigger contribution, get more visibility within the company. What kind of advice would you have for someone in that position?
I always highly rate people who have energy and initiative. They think, the old cliche, think outside the box. They've not gone down a straight line, regurgitating what they're finding online, but they're interpreting it. And this brings in one of my other favourite sayings, which is "so what?", which is really quite an offensive comment to make in British terms. So what? So what? But actually, it's inviting critical thinking. It's inviting development of ideas. So if you can demonstrate that you don't take things at face value, you are open-minded to reading, and you should be reading Twitter, academic journals, law enforcement, strategic reports, what's coming on the horizon. So it's always staying that one step ahead, because you need to be one step ahead of the bad guys. So it's that sort of energy, creativity, critical thinking. Critical thinking is a good thing. But set yourself apart, take on home projects. I know in threat intelligence and more the technical side, you have home labs. So do it at home, set up virtual machines, practicing capture the flag, volunteering events, and just build a presence for yourself. And I really believe that it builds your own confidence and it really makes you an authentic contributor to the community.
I just think about, because I think there's the type of person that almost shuts their brain off after university and just wants to show up every day and push a button and just kind of coast through the working world. I'm like, man, a lot of that stuff can get automated over time. That's not a great position to be in. But that person who, like you said, is reading about what's going on, reading the different reports in the industry, kind of connecting all the different ideas is, the type of person that it's hard to find, number one, as someone who's been on the hiring side of the desk before. I always remembered that when I was a manager at a publishing company before working at LifeRaft, you'd get people all the time that could regurgitate the answers for a test for whatever needed to be done. It's like, okay, that's great. You're not in university anymore. Can you see how this impact on this side of the world impacts how things are going on over here? Or have the confidence to make a recommendation to, an investor or a management team and stuff like that. And like you said, thinking outside the box, but making those connections and taking that initiative. It's hard to find when you're looking for those types of people, but it's so, so valued.
I think there's a certain spark. And if you don't have that it's a personal passion, and you can speak to people who want to be in a cool field, they want to work for a cool brand. It's visible, but to know, and you shouldn't have to make sacrifices and take a low-paid job for it. But if you can dedicate that this is in your blood, what you've done to get here, anything interesting you've seen, flag up a new tool that someone's pitching on Twitter. It just goes that extra X% just to show that it's important to you, you're embracing the need, and you're a contributor to the team. So that's always great to see.
How do you identify that kind of passion when you have a candidate sitting across the desk from you looking for a role?
I mean, you can see their eyes light up, that they step away from a robotic. They're not in the room of interviews anymore. They're sort of going, because I read this, or I really wanted to try OSINT ever since my dog went missing, and I certainly was able to find all these different message boards which I could post information about my dog. I could track down where he was pinging on his Apple tag. It's somebody has experience where they've knew it or just been inspired by other people in the field. So I'm very open and sort of available on social media, I guess, and LinkedIn, Twitter, and I wholeheartedly encourage people to engage, to discuss things, to throw ideas out there. And it's rewarding for me to see sort of people who genuinely want it, will demonstrate it and work for it. So two-way street.
Yeah, I'll just throw this out to you, but my strategy was always, I used to go based on just resumes, credentials. I never worked out. And so what I started to do would just be start shooting the breeze of a conversation. Who's someone in this field that you admire? Or if I was hiring an OSINT analyst, who's an OSINT analyst that you admire? And be like, 5 names on Twitter you should be able to name right away, 5 blogs you read or whatever. It should not be difficult at all for someone who's really excited about this. But That's probably not a question you've prepped for. And if you're struggling with that right off the bat, I'm going to be like, what are you doing in my office?
You want to see these people in their authentic selves. So if somebody's passed the preliminary checks of submitting a CV, I'll say, I just want to get to know you, just have a quick 20-minute chat, video call. You instill in them that this is just to getting to know each other, and you will start to see people thaw out and to start to talk about things. If they're late to the call or they're just struggling or they're too rigid, it's not in the blood. I think certain things can be trained, but you do get a feel for people that it's natural to them. And there are certain stages thereafter you can set assessments, which I'm sure many people love. It's been done and people, they're calling the businesses in a case study. And it's like, it's showing initiative. It's showing thinking outside the box again. So yeah, it's a creative environment to get people to come out of their shell and demonstrate their flair.
What's a common mistake that you see from a lot of candidates when they show up in an interview for a role at your company?
Not listening to the question even. I've had one example where I've asked somebody just to sort of briefly introduce themselves and they've commandeered the interview for 20 minutes, raving about their experience in hostage negotiation. And it's like very impressive, but this is a talk about a job and your suitability for that. So let's move on. Yeah,
we're not dealing with that here. There's no hostage.
I think you've answered all my questions now. We'll be in touch. You want somebody just to be natural. I do like the idea that it's a two-way conversation. So ask me about what the job entails, what the expectations are, what the challenges are, to see that you want that job as well. But it's got to be a two-way match. I've known people, there's one example where we hired a contractor to cover long-term sickness leave. They lasted one day and didn't turn up the second day. I'd be lying to say if I didn't take it personally, but not enough research was done on both sides to see that this position was right for them. So no, it's I'm not sure. I'll ask somebody if we hope to see you tomorrow anymore. You think you'll come back tomorrow, and that one time it didn't happen. So that was quite notorious.
I'm kind of curious to dive into that one after the recording to hear more about that story.
We'll go into that one. Yeah,
that might be for Talking Threat Intelligence After Hours.
First email of the day, and I think my jaw hit the desk. So it's just like, I won't be coming in today. Thanks anyway.
It's nice meeting you all. All right. Kelly, we're coming up on all the time that I promised to steal from you today. What's the main takeaway that you want listeners to remember from our conversation?
I guess it applies to anything in life. By all means, really do get stuck into OSINT work, exploitation of open source intelligence. Don't forget it's a product and not a process. It's an actual thing. It's that product from processing information and data. But do it properly. Do everything in the process properly. Seek others' advice, seek others' ideas in that process. But don't let haste and excitement get away from you, because inevitably it'll cost you later. So get into the practice of doing things to a structure and a disciplined, security, clean manner, and it'll pay off and that will reflect well on you.
All right, Kelly, what are you working on now, and how can listeners get in touch if they want to reach out?
I'm commonplace on LinkedIn. You'll find me under my name, Kelly, and that's Pereira, Pereira. I do have a pseudonym account on Twitter. See if you can work out what that is. It is out there. Apparently, one time I disclosed it, it's out there. But yeah, it's always happy to mentor, always happy to share ideas. So don't be shy. Come and say hi. And ending on a rhyme.
All right, Kelly, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. I've really enjoyed it. Take care.
Again, that was Kelly Pereira, Investigations Manager in the Content Protection Industry. Thanks for listening to Talking Threat Intelligence. Never miss an episode by subscribing to the show, all the normal places where you listen to your podcasts. And if you'd like more insights on building a successful threat intelligence program, be sure to check out our fabulous resource page at lifebraffinc.com/blog. That's lifebraffinc.com/blog. See you next time.